From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Mary Lou Reeker, and on behalf of the Kluge Center and the Office of Scholarly Programs of the Library of Congress, I want to welcome you to a talk by Dr. Peter Elstoff entitled The Great Tradition of Ancient South Asia, from Sanskrit Literature to the Archaeology of the Harappan Civilization. Dr. Peter Elstoff received his MA in South Asian Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and in 2002, his PhD in anthropology from Harvard University. He came to the Kluge Center directly from holding an Alexander von Humboldt postdoctoral fellowship at Freie Universität Berlin. Dr. Elstoff has received numerous fellowships, awards, and grants from institutions such as the American School of Prehistoric Research and the Peabody Museum, both of those for fieldwork in Pakistan. But his archaeological work and his field experience has been not only in Pakistan, but also in India, Russia, Jordan, and the Ukraine, as well as Tajikistan. He has published articles in academic journals that include Pakistan Heritage and the Journal of Non-European Archaeology, and also in the occasional papers of the Indus Project, which are published by Kyoto Institute for Humanity and Culture. When he first arrived at the Kluge Center, his book had just come out, and we were all very happy to see From Harappa to Hastinapura, the study of the earliest South Asian city and civilization. The book was published in 2007 by E.J. Brill, which has been, I found out, producing books for over 325 years. The book looks at controversial issues of continuity and tradition in proto-historic and early historic South Asia. So I hope you will help me to welcome today Dr. Peter Elstoff.
Thank you very much, Mary Lou, for this very generous introduction. The title of this lecture, as you can see, is very broad, because I wanted to give a more of a general introduction about this field of study, but towards the end, I'll be also talking more specifically about my most recent research. The notion of the great tradition, as it's usually defined by anthropologists and historians, includes a very large variety of cultural continuities. In historical terms, they can be defined as the long durée, the term which is frequently used by the great French historian Fernand Braudel. In the context of ancient South Asia, defining the great tradition, of course, is a very challenging enterprise, as one needs to analyze significant amounts of data from different disciplines, from archaeology, philology, and linguistics. Today also this question has become extremely political, as the perception of the past are constantly used in modern political debates, and South Asia is a great example. Basically, almost every issue of ancient South Asian history is vociferously debated today. On this slide, you can see some of these most controversial issues of South Asian proto-history. The Indus Harappan civilization, which is a highly sophisticated ancient culture that flourished in the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, and in fact was the largest culture of the Eurasian world at its time, remains largely a great enigma. Then from the comparative linguistics and philology, we inherit a very influential, yet extremely controversial paradigm of the so-called Indo-Iranians, Indo-Aryans. The trouble is that the linguistic terms intended initially to designate exclusively the speakers of certain languages were equated with race, ethnicity, and eventually politics. The story that linguists tell us is quite straightforward. A large family of languages, which is called Indo-European, came from one proto-language, which is tentatively called Proto-Indo-European. Indo-Iranian and Indo-Aryan are the intermediate branches of these languages. The location of the people who spoke Proto-Indo-European, as well as the trajectories of its dispersal, are extremely controversial. Moreover, many scholars in India today now basically argue that Proto-Indo-European was spoken in India and all the Indo-European languages basically came from South Asia. Very few serious linguists in Europe and the US support these ideas, yet it poses a number of political and ideological debates. Finally, the Rig Veda, which is the earliest text of the Indo-Aryans, also incites enormous controversy. The traditional explanation is that the earliest hymns of the Rig Veda date to the middle of the second millennium BC. Yet, if this date is correct, there is no clear archaeological identity of the culture associated with the Rig Veda, of the so-called Vedic culture, as the Harappan civilization disintegrates in the first half of the second millennium BC. And again, a number of archaeologists today in modern South Asia are now saying that either Vedic literature precedes the emergence of the Harappan civilization, or Vedic literature was a product of Harappan culture. In summary, we're basically facing a humongous confusion. There is no consensus on any of these questions. And moreover, each of these questions incites vociferous ideological debates and accusations. In this sense, it's clearly for very good reasons that the recent book by the well-known archaeologist Dilip Chakrabarty from Cambridge University is titled "The Battle for Ancient India." This is indeed a battle, and a severe battle. I, of course, am not going to provide an answer to each of these controversial questions. Hopefully, maybe when I'm 70 years old, I will to some of them. Yet I will talk about some of them today, and in particular, my current research focuses on the understanding of the Harappan society and on whether Sanskrit literature can help us in any manner to better understand this unique culture and society. I do not know how much you know about the Harappan civilization, so I thought that in this lecture I need to make a very brief general introduction. The Harappan culture flourished in the second half of the third millennium BC, which puts it chronologically slightly after the earliest Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilization, though this is also, one must say, a point of controversy because there are now people in India who are trying to say that actually the period of efflorescence of this civilization is contemporaneous with the Egyptian civilization. This was clearly the largest civilization of the ancient world at its time. At its stretch from Gujarat and Haryana, you can see the map here in the east, to the Makran coast in Afghanistan in the west, from the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Kutch in the south to northern Afghanistan in the north. Scholars still argue how this civilization came about and how it gradually disintegrated in the beginning of the second millennium BC, and most unfortunately, we cannot read its writing, as after all the years of research, the script remains undeciphered. Moreover, it's still questioned whether this script presents an actual full-blown writing system, and I will talk about it later. The Harappan civilization is known for its great urban centers. Harappa is one of them. You can see here the current chronology defined by Harappa, for Harappa. One of the most distinctive features of the sites of the Harappan civilization is so-called segregation, as most of them are divided in sectors with the help of mud brick walls and massive platforms. Here is a set of Harappan pottery from the period of its efflorescence. Even the sites which have been extensively excavated pose many puzzles as far as their architectural and other archaeological features are concerned. Basically, we know very little about the functions of these features. Here you can see the so-called granary, largely a misnomer. It was called a granary by the first excavators, yet there is really no evidence as far as the function of this monumental structure is concerned. One must say that in contrast to other ancient civilizations, and I'll be talking about it shortly, Harappan sites lack monumental structures of political or religious character. Here is another famous yet very enigmatic structure excavated at the site of Harappa. This is a set of so-called circular platforms. Various theories have been suggested as far as their function is concerned, yet no consensus has been achieved. Here is another view of the platforms. Mohenjo-Daro is ultimately the best-known site of the Harappan civilization, excavated extensively in 1920s and 1930s. Much new research was also carried out in the 1980s by the joint Italian-German team. And this is arguably the best preserved, or at least one of the best preserved Bronze Age cities in the ancient world. You can still walk through the streets of Mohenjo-Daro, and some of the original walls stand to 2-3 meters high. Emphasis on water, or even one could say obsession with water, is one of the most distinctive traits of this city. On the right side, you see the famous bath, which may have been used for ritual purposes. Mohenjo-Daro has several hundred wells, and its main area was built over a grandiose mud brick platform. On the top of this slide, you see the two famous symbols of the Harappan civilization, which both came from Mohenjo-Daro, the head of the so-called priest king and the figure of the dancing girl. Here's one of the narrow streets of Mohenjo-Daro in the so-called DKG area. You can see here a long drain as well, another distinctive feature of Harappan urban planning. The last site that I would like to show here in this brief introduction is the site of Dholavira, which was recently excavated in India. The reason why I would like to mention it is to make a point that despite many years of excavations and despite the fact that many sites have been exposed since the discovery of this civilization, very much remains to be done. There are many, many sites which are well known, yet have never been excavated. And there are many sites which are still to be discovered. Dholavira is a good example, is a unique and grandiose site defined by massive fortification system. Here you can see the top plans of some of the well-known Harappan sites excavated in different years of the 20th century. Despite all this research, Harappan civilization, as I said, remains one of the most enigmatic and unique cultures of the ancient world. What makes this civilization particularly unique is a very puzzling character of its archaeological record. And let me briefly say why I think it's so puzzling. The first trait which I would like to mention is settlement layout. I've mentioned briefly that one of the most distinctive traits of this civilization is urban segregation. Moreover, this segregation is three-dimensional. Look at the top plan of this site. This site is called Nausharo. It's located at the foot of Bolan Pass in Baluchistan. In Pakistan, it was extensively excavated by the French Archaeological Mission in the 1980s, 1990s. This mid-sized size, as you can see on this top plan, is divided and circumvallated by very massive structures. Here are more slides how the remains of this sites look today. Here is a hypothetical drawing of Harappa by its excavator Mike Kenoyer. You can see here that this site is divided in several distinct areas. Already in the early Harappan period, in the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, it was divided in at least two parts of this city. And what is important, these parts are not necessarily differentiated in terms of architecture and other features. The second trait is monumental architecture. This has, of course, been argued by many archaeologists, one of the defining features of ancient civilizations. Harappan civilization has a lot of monumental architecture, but this monumental architecture is very different from other ancient civilizations. Look at the top plans of these sites. You will right away see that many have walls, gates, and you won't see on the top plans, but I can tell you they also built on massive platforms of different sizes and different heights. Yet they lack easily definable palaces and temples. On this slide, you can see hypothetical reconstructions of the sites of Dholavira, Lothal, and Harappa. You see the monumentality is general, typical of fortifications of the walls, and fortification is, of course, a misnomer because, like I myself in some of my previous publications argued that these fortifications carry mostly a symbolic function, not a defensive function. I'll come back to this question briefly. The third feature is territorial expansionism. The Harappans, as I've mentioned, was the largest in the earliest, in the 3rd millennium BC, was the largest civilization. Here you can see the scale of its spread again. Clearly did not develop in all of these places simultaneously, so it must have expanded hugely at the time of its existence. This type of expansionism is, of course, very well known from other ancient civilizations. And in fact, was arguably a characteristic feature of most ancient civilization. Yet in the context of the Harappan culture, the chronology, trajectories, and most importantly, reasons beyond this expansionism are very poorly known, and it indeed was tremendous expansionism. Intercultural relations. We know, I come myself from a school where much emphasis comes on the intercultural relations in the ancient world, and the ancient world was closely interconnected much before the emergence of ancient civilization, already during the Neolithic period. The remarkable trait of the Harappan culture, however, is that there is a striking lack of exported commodities in its settlements. At the same time, there are very many Harappan products outside of the Harappan civilization. Here you can see the so-called black slip jar, which are found outside in the Persian Gulf. But we have a clear disproportion. The question is, maybe there was some kind of prohibition imposed on exported goods. The question of the religion of the Harappans is also a huge enigma. The main source for us for understanding their religion is iconography and figurines. And much research has been focused on parallels with later historical traditions in later historical India. One of the main themes in iconography is unicorn. There has been much literature on the meaning of this animal. Architecture, of course, has been used as well, yet the only structure which is usually associated with ritual activities is this great bath at Mohenjo-daro. There has been several attempts to find temples, yet they're not very convincing. Here you can see the so-called the HR area excavated in the 1930s in Mohenjo-daro. Based on association with some finds, it has been argued that two buildings here might have been temples. Overall, however, one must say that a striking feature of the Harappan archaeology, a truly striking, is that we don't have easily identifiable temples like we do have, say, in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Maya. Funeral practices are also extremely different from many ancient civilizations, and the most striking difference is their relative modesty. Here is one of the typical Harappan burials, and I would like to emphasize that this burial is relatively wealthy. Moreover, the number of buried individuals stand in a striking contrast to the number of potential residents of the sites. It seems that there must have been another way of disposing the dead, while burying in the ground, even in this modest way, was some kind of a privilege. For a comparison, here are some of the grave goods from the famous royal cemetery at Ur in Mesopotamia, which is exactly contemporaneous with the mature period of the Harappan civilization. Here are the famous carpets and chariot from the Siberian burials of the Pazyryk culture, which are much later, almost 2,000 later than Harappan civilization, and a culture which was clearly, in many ways, less complex than the Harappan culture. Even some burials of Mergar, the site in Baluchistan, which preceded the emergence of Harappan civilization in South Asia, can be seen as somewhat more complex. This Neolithic burial, which dates 1,000 years before the emergence of the Harappan civilization, has 5 young goats, likely an indicator of the status of the deceased. This child burial from Mergar has a nice offset jewelry. And here is this Harappan burial again, from different angles. Here are 2 more Harappan burials, and this, I would emphasize, are quite wealthy. Clearly, there must have been some ideology change that led to this remarkable standardization of burials, and they are becoming modest. The modesty of these burials, of course, does not have to be seen as the indicator of the social homogeneity. A distant, yet I think fair and good example is Arlington Cemetery in Washington. This is one of the most prestigious cemeteries of course, very complex and very rich society, the United States of America, yet it's both very standardized and very modest. Artistic traditions of the Harappan culture are also very unique. You can see here beautiful jewelry, seals, small culture, yet there is an absolute lack of what one could call monumental sculpture and lavish religious or political paraphernalia. Finally, I would like to say a few words about what I would call the flow of information. As I mentioned above, many scholars have tried to decipher the script, and there is actually a separate monograph just reviewing all the attempts at the decipherment. No consensus has been reached, and moreover, just recently several authors have argued that maybe this is not a script. So here is a photo of one of the famous decipherers, Yuri Knorozov, a legendary Russian ethnographer who managed to crack the Maya script and did not succeed with the Harappan writing. His suggestion was that it was a script of a Dravidian language, an idea which is also supported by some other scholars. So this overview might be sort of discouraging. What we have really a number of puzzles which make the social structure, political organization, ethno-linguistic identity, and religions of the Harappans the point of great controversy. Now, a number of scholars keep telling us that the Harappan civilization was an archaic state. You will find books and articles on this subject. I believe this approach is very misleading. And let me say a few words about the concept of the state and what I think about it. Pre-modern and non-Western intellectual traditions, of course, had various theories of political structures, which are somewhat similar to the idea of the state. Yet, in its modern meaning, the idea of the state is clearly a product of the Renaissance, Enlightenment, post-Renaissance, post-Enlightenment, and its origin is usually associated with the writings of two people, Niccolò Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. In the 19th century, the concept of the state became a key element of evolutionary schemes, and in particular became associated with the idea of civilization. So my point, basically, if one uses the concept of the state today very broadly in historical analysis, and in particular if one applies this very indiscriminately to the societies and cultures around the world, he or she pretty much follows one of the paradigms of cultural evolution. And the state then really becomes distinguished by four traits, which I define as linearity, evolutionism, universality, and the hierarchical character of social relations. So what happens that in essence, if we use the concept of the state indiscriminately in the study of ancient world, or of the ancient world, we do not move any far away from the deeply essentialist philosophy of Hegel, who famously defined the state as the Geist, the spirit, which literally realizes itself in world history. It's the essence of the world, or literally, as Hegel called it, the march of God in the world. My point that regardless of today's scientific connotations, if we call every ancient society a state, it pretty much remains what Hegel called it. My own take to the study of the ancient world, and for that matter to the study of the modern world, is based on a simple presumption that the world is too diverse. Therefore, I don't favor very general comparative studies, which, in my view, often create nothing but a structure for the sake of the structure. And I'm not in favor of cultural evolutionism because maybe it's too much indoctrinated in my first years by Marxism, but I'm not. If we consider, again, carefully and look at this slide at the unique traits of the Harappan archaeology, it seems very reasonable to me to approach these traits in their own terms without use of modern extraneous theories. So what is then our choice? Now, coming back to the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that one of the most controversial issues of South Asian proto-history is the historical value of Sanskrit literature. With the emergence and development of Sanskrit literature, while the emergence and development of Sanskrit literature is contemporaneous, you can see on this slide, with the early historical India, and in particular with the so-called Indus Civilization, the relation of this literature to the archaeology of the Harappan civilization is complicated by a significant chronological gap. So the question is there any meaningful way to use this literature in the analysis of archaeological data? not only for the study of early historical India, but for the study of the Harappan civilization. My take on this issue is quite simple. These texts do not have to be looked upon exclusively as sources of facts, but more so as sources of ideas. A few months ago, Harappan spoke here about exactly this subject, about the historical value of ancient Indian texts. She described in great detail different perceptions of the historical value of Sanskrit literature. Well, I would like to suggest a slightly different perspective. Sanskrit literature, in my view, indeed does not provide much for the reconstruction of one would call factual history. But history is not about facts. I believe those historians and agree with those historians and philosophers who argue that any history, even chronicles, are always profoundly interpretative. And Sanskrit literature, in meanwhile, is extremely rich in sociopolitical and cultural theory. Many concepts absorbed in this literature give us an idea of ancient sociopolitical mentalities. In other words, how people in ancient India thought about different things: society, culture, state, and so on. My argument is that these mentalities, these ideas, can present a great intellectual source for us on how to interpret the societies and cultures of ancient South Asia. An example of how I've previously applied this method is my recent book dealing with the idea of the ancient Indian city in the Harappan and Indus civilization. What I've tried to do there is I basically took the mythological and conventional definitions in the city, of the city found in a variety of texts, and assumed that within this definition, despite their apparent and mythological character, one can find very abstract concepts of the city, or in other words, one can see how the people themselves defined the city. This research was importantly, of course, based on the assumption that there is no and cannot be one universal correct definition of the city. In other words, the city is a pretty subjective phenomenon. The phenomenon of the city does not exist without the idea how people define it. And my conclusion was quite straightforward. I basically argued that despite all their differences, a large variety of ancient Indian texts reflected a concept of the city according to which the two key characteristics were authority and fortifications, power and space. Then I used this formula as a working hypothesis for the analysis of a number of archaeological sites from both the Harappan and Indus civilization. And this analysis led me to the conclusion that the emergence of these cities in these two civilizations, at least in its initial stages, was indeed marked by the concurrent construction of fortification and the emergence of power. I recently redefined this formula as a local power circumscribed by space. So now let's come back to the idea of the state. My argument is basically that the unique traits of this civilization should not and cannot be properly conceptualized with the help of an idea, which is deeply rooted in the political philosophy of Renaissance Enlightenment in the 19th century, and they're reflective of the processes and phenomena in these cultures. So instead, as in the case with the idea of the city, I again suggest looking at ancient Indian sociopolitical thought as a sort of intellectual inspiration. By doing this, I would like to emphasize, I do not mean to say that the proper and the only way to understand this culture is exclusively by using ancient Indian ideas. I do, however, believe that these ideas may help us to construct our own interpretation. So after reading and rereading many Sanskrit and Pali texts, I came to the conclusion that there are four main lines of thought that may be indicative of long-term continuities, even if this literature is dated after the Harappan civilization, much later after the Harappan civilization. And these lines of thought are the relations between sacred and profane, the notion of polity, the ideology of death, and the flow of information. I will talk today very briefly about my most recent research, which has to do with the first of these 4 points, the dynamics of interaction between sacred and profane, between religious and secular authority. Vedic literature, which is the most ancient corpus of religious texts in Sanskrit, contains a very unique and a very interesting theory, which I would call the Brahma-Kshatra theory. Previously, this theory has been regarded as a simple intellectual offshoot of the so-called Varna system, of which some of you are certainly aware. The Varna system, or the Varna theory, is a foundation for the caste system, as it divides society into 4 groups: the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. My point is that one needs to differentiate between the Varna system and the Brahma-Kshatra theory. The Brahma-Kshatra theory is found in the very earliest layers of Vedic literature and, remarkably, does not portray the relations between secular and religious power in hierarchical terms. It's, of course, well known that the Varna system is very hierarchical, usually hierarchical, and Brahman usually stands supreme. In the Brahma-Kshatra theory, first of all, we are not dealing with the Brahmin, Kshatriya, and other social groups. We're dealing with the Brahma and Kshatra as the abstract concepts of secular and religious power. Moreover, we get a compound word which unites the notions of Brahma and Kshatra in the single concept of the unified societal power, secular and religious power. The most remarkable thing about this concept is that it implies what I would call hierarchical instead of hierarchical, dialectical, and very competitive relation between these 2 main domains of power, basically priests and kings. There are very many episodes in Vedic texts, particularly in the Vedas and the Brahmanas, which elaborate on this theory. I just finished a massive review of this text, and I'm in the process of publishing it. So I'm not going to torture you with long quotes and translations. I will give you just 2 examples. This is a quote from the famous text called Brihadaranyaka Upanishada, a philosophical text, which deals largely with the idea of Brahman. In this specific quote, we are first told that Brahma was the only one in the beginning, so the religious power, yet it didn't manifest itself completely, so it created the secular power of Kshatriya. Then, in the next sentence, we are, however, told right away that there is nothing higher in this world than the power of secular power. So these constant dialectics are very typical of this theory. And here is another one more famous episode from the Aitareya Brahmana, a text which presents a theosophical commentary on the Rig Veda. In this episode, we are told that the Brahma-Kshatra, as this unified power, was created after the creation of sacrifice. Then we get a set of 2 prayers, 2 mantras, very remarkable. In one, the sacrificer says, "May Brahma protect me from the Kshatra." And right away, in the next mantra, "Let the Kshatra protect me from Brahma." So this kind of dialectics is found throughout early and middle Vedic literature, yet amazingly, it completely disappears in late Vedic literature and later Sanskrit texts. My point here is straightforward yet somewhat controversial. I believe that this theory may in fact be a rudiment of the great tradition which predates the emergence of Vedic literature and possibly reflects some social processes and phenomena typical of the Harappan civilization. What is very interesting that neither Brahma nor Kshatra have easily traceable cognates in Indo-European languages and in Proto-Indo-European. This, of course, goes against a lot of linguistics and goes against a very influential theory by Georges de Musil, the famous French scholar who made a huge impact on the so-called Indo-European studies and who believed that the whole idea of the social tripartition and bipartition, particular characteristics of the cultures of Indo-European speaking people. In the case of ancient South Asia, my suggestion is what we have in Varna and caste system is the result of great cultural syncretism between Indo-European and Harappan social models. And the model of the Harappan social system makes a particular emphasis on the hierarchical and competitive relations between sacred and profane. So the big question now, of course you can ask me because I gave you all these ideas from the text, is how do I show this archaeologically? I'm working on this at the moment, and I'll give you just a few examples of some of my most recent ideas. I believe that many of these puzzling traits, which I've been talking about earlier, will acquire a completely different meaning when looked at from the point of view of this specific theory. Let's first consider architecture. I mentioned that Harappan sites lack lavish temples and religious paraphernalia. This, however, doesn't mean that there are no rich residential houses. Let's look one more time at Mohenjo-Daro, the site which has been extensively excavated. The area which was excavated in the south of the site, see that the bottom is called HR, after the name of one of its excavators. Here is the detailed map of this area. Here is another one which is probably looks a little bit better on this slide. You can see here that there are many big houses. In fact, some of these houses are up to 200 square meters or more, which would be a very nice house even in Washington, D.C. today. This is how this area looks today. The site has been preserved by UNESCO. So you can see some big houses. This is, for example, a famous house, the remains. There has been an interesting study of Harappan residential architecture which shows that there are wealthy houses and there is no much distinction between these houses. So while there is a clear distinction between the poor and wealthy, there is no clear distinction between the levels of wealth, between the wealthy and the wealthy. This, of course, doesn't mean that there was no distinction and that the status of the individuals who lived in these houses was similar. Yet what I'm suggesting it may mean that there was some kind of a prohibition imposed on the display of lavish wealth. The question then is whether this prohibition could have been caused by competition, and by peculiar relations between secular and religious power. Here is another extensively excavated area of Mohenjo-Daro, which is so-called DKG area, located in the north of the site. Here is again this area showing the distribution of different types of houses. The pattern is again quite similar. While there are big houses, the general picture is quite homogeneous, maybe with just a few exceptions. Here you can see how DKG looks today. This is the famous so-called First Street. This building has been suggested that it might have been a palace just based on mere size of it, but has not been convincingly shown either. This is a well. So, and similar situation is with the funeral complexes. As I've just mentioned, there are several striking features that characterize the burial customs. First of all, they're quite modest, particularly when compared to the burial customs of other complex societies. And second, there are simply not enough burials compared to the number of residents which must have lived at these sites. So now looking again at the puzzling traits of the Harappan archaeological record, I would like to suggest that at least several of these traits would acquire totally different meaning when you consider them from the point of view of the Brahma-Kshatra theory. In particular, I'm talking about the lack of palaces and temples, the modesty of funeral practices, the lack of monumental art and lavish paraphernalia, and the limited character of writing. Basically, what I'm suggesting is that the perpetual competition and a hierarchical character of relations between the main two domains of power, the sacred and profane, in the Harappan civilization, brought a prohibition on the display of wealth and resulted in what one could call the institutionalized modesty in society. This is, of course, just one of those four broadly defined traits of the great tradition, which I said can be investigated and I think should be investigated. I'll proceed with my further investigation of the idea of polity, the ideology of death and the flow of information. Maybe it will take me another 20 years. Regarding the political connotation of this whole issue, I would like just to say that I don't see anything wrong in seeing the beginning of the ancient Indian civilization in the Harappan or even pre-Harappan period. I, in fact, published a paper which is specifically called The Idea of Ancient Indian Civilization in Sanskrit Literature and Archaeological Data, which is a separate subject. As long as one doesn't limit himself or herself to one ethnicity, one language, one religion, and as long as one envisions the idea of civilization in very broad multicultural and multilinguistic terms, the ancient Indian civilization was clearly, in my view, shaped in many ways during the Harappan period. And this one be what I've tried to sort of show today, one trait which is reflected in Vedic literature, the relations between sacred and religious power. What I'm trying to see now, which other specific sociopolitical aspects were shaped during this period and then became characteristic of later historical Indian traditions. And importantly, I think if one approaches South Asian proto-history in this way, the whole issue of Aryan migration, which is such a painful issue for a lot of people in India today, or non-migration, is not that hugely important, as many traits of the ancient Indian civilization had been shaped before the second millennium BC. That's clear. So the Aryan migration, even if it accepted and if it adds very many elements, it doesn't alter fundamentally the course and the development of the ancient Indian civilization. Well, before I end, I would like to express my acknowledgement to the Kluge Center and to a large number of foundation universities and libraries which have supported my research also in the last 5 or 6 years or so. And of course, none of my ideas would have been possible without my long-term collaboration and friendship with a number of great scholars in the US, Europe, and Asia, to whom I am, of course, greatly thankful and would like to express my gratitude. I'll finish here. Thank you for your attention.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.